Marcus couldn't shake the feeling. It had started subtly, a casual observation here, and odd behavior there. But over the last few months, these small, innocuous details began adding up. Madison's phone was now always on silent. There were more late-night meetings and weekend getaways with friends that he'd never met. Even when they were together, she seemed distant, her eyes drifting elsewhere as if she were in another world entirely. She's almost pregnant. They'd been together for 7 years, built a life, were expecting their first child, and yet, an invisible wall seemed to be growing between them. One evening, Marcus was sitting on the couch, nursing a glass of whiskey, when he heard the front door open and close quietly. Madison had said she'd be working late, but it was well past midnight. She slipped into the living room, wearing a casual smile. "Hey," she greeted him, her voice a little too bright. She hung her coat by the door and walked over, her heels clicking softly on the floor. "Late night?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone light, but his eyes searched her face, looking for answers. "Yeah, work's been crazy," Madison replied, turning her head to avoid his gaze. "You know how it is? Sometimes it just runs late." She walked into the kitchen, heading toward the sink. He stood up, following her. "What kind of project are you working on? You've been pulling these late nights pretty often now." She glanced back at him, a touch of annoyance flashing in her eyes. "It's just a project. It's complicated." Marcus nodded slowly, watching her as she filled a glass of water. She took a long sip, her eyes fixed on the wall, as if she were trying to escape his presence. "Anything I can help with?" He tried again, hoping to keep the conversation going. "No, it's fine, Marcus," she said, her tone clipped. "I know it's late. Let's talk tomorrow." He nodded, watching as she walked down the hallway and disappeared into their bedroom. His mind churned with unease, every response she'd given him feeling rehearsed, as if she'd prepared for his questions in advance. As much as he wanted to believe her, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later that night, after she'd fallen asleep, he sat beside her on the bed, staring at her phone on the nightstand. He reached for it, hesitating for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to invade her privacy, but the nagging suspicion gnawed at him. This was his wife, the mother of his unborn child, and he deserved to know if something was going on. He tapped the screen, but it was locked. She'd never had a lock on her phone before, and that small detail felt like a punch to his gut. Why would she suddenly need to hide things? Letting out a frustrated sigh, he set the phone back down. He couldn't confront her without proof. Anything less would be baseless accusations that might ruin their marriage if he was wrong. But he couldn't just ignore the feeling, either. The next morning, over breakfast, he tried to observe her, looking for any sign, any clue that would give him answers. She sipped her coffee, scrolling through her phone casually, seeming relaxed, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "Any plans for the weekend?" he asked, keeping his tone light. "Actually, yes," she replied after a pause. "I'm going to see some old friends from college. It's been ages, and they've been wanting to meet up." He raised an eyebrow. "I thought you were staying in town this weekend. It's been a while since we had a weekend together." She glanced up, her eyes darting to him, before giving a small, apologetic smile. "I know, but they already booked the cabin, and I didn't want to back out." "Where's this cabin?" he asked, unable to mask the edge in his voice. "Upstate," she replied, her tone casual. "Just a few hours away. I'll be back on Sunday." A silence settled between them, both of them staring at their plates. He could feel the tension hanging in the air, but she looked away, as if she didn't notice or was determined to ignore it. "All right," he said finally, forcing a smile. "Have fun." He watched as she took a bite of her toast, her face relaxed, her demeanor cool. If there was anything going on, she was hiding it well. But that same, calm facade made his suspicion burn hotter. That weekend, after Madison left for her getaway, Marcus felt an uneasy freedom settle over him. He had the house to himself, yet it felt emptier than ever. Restlessness gnawed at him, the silence amplifying every doubt, every anxious thought that lingered in his mind. Hours ticked by, each one making him feel more agitated. Finally, he picked up his phone and scrolled through their shared photo albums, looking for the memories they'd made over the years. Vacations, holidays, family gatherings. Each photo reminded him of the life they'd built together, a life he now felt slipping through his fingers. Was he overreacting, or was there something deeper going on? Just then, his phone buzzed with a message from his friend, Javier. "Hey man, are you free? Let's grab a drink." Marcus stared at the message, hesitating. Javier was one of his closest friends, and he knew he could count on him for anything, but part of him wasn't ready to voice his fears. Despite that, he sent back a quick reply. Later that night, they were sitting at a quiet bar, 2 drinks in. Javier could sense something was bothering Marcus, and after a bit of small talk, he cut straight to the point. "All right, Marcus, out with it. What's going on? You seem off." Marcus sighed, staring at his glass. "It's Madison. I don't know, man. She's been acting different lately. More secretive." Javier leaned in, his eyes serious. "Different how?" Marcus told him about the late-night meetings, the sudden trips, the changes he'd noticed. As he spoke, Javier's expression grew more concerned. "Have you talked to her about it?" Javier asked carefully. "I tried," Marcus replied, his voice tight with frustration. "But she just brushes me off. Says it's all work-related or just with friends." Javier frowned. "If it's making you feel like this, you have to find out what's going on. Otherwise, it'll eat you alive." Marcus nodded, absorbing his friend's words. Javier was right. This situation wouldn't resolve itself. But how far was he willing to go to get answers? The thought of hiring someone to track Madison made his stomach twist, but without proof, he'd only be grasping at shadows. "I'm not saying it's easy," Javier added, clapping him on the shoulder. "But if something's going on, you deserve to know." Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. He knew what he had to do, but he wasn't ready to face the truth, whatever it might be. Part of him hoped that this would all turn out to be some misunderstanding. But another part, a darker, more cynical part, braced itself for what lay ahead. By Sunday evening, Marcus was alone at home again, pacing the living room, the walls seeming to close in on him. When Madison finally returned, he tried to read her face, but she gave him the same calm, unreadable look she'd perfected. "Good trip?" he asked, keeping his tone casual, though he knew she could probably see the tension in his eyes. She nodded, setting down her bag. "Yeah, it was nice. The cabin was beautiful." He forced a smile, nodding along as she gave a brief description of her weekend. But deep down, the doubts only grew, nagging at him. He was ready to find out the truth, whatever it would cost him. Marcus had barely spoken to Madison since their tense conversation about her recent weekend trip. He'd been preoccupied with an unease that only seemed to deepen, a gnawing sense that something wasn't just amiss, it was wrong. His instincts, which he'd once dismissed as paranoia, now felt like cold, hard truth. A few weeks later, his younger brother, Tristan, stopped by for a visit. Tristan was the sort of brother everyone admired. Outgoing, charming, and someone Marcus had always trusted. They hadn't seen each other much lately, so when Tristan called saying he'd drop by, Marcus felt a surge of relief. Maybe he could distract himself from his worries for a while. As they sat in the living room, catching up, Madison came in with coffee for them. She handed Marcus his cup, then placed Tristan's down on the coffee table, her hand lingering a moment too long. Marcus noticed the way they exchanged glances, subtle but unmistakable. It was a look he recognized, warm, familiar, and oddly charged. Marcus cleared his throat, trying to mask his discomfort. "So, Tristan," he said, forcing a smile, "how's work treating you these days?" Tristan broke eye contact with Madison and turned to him, smiling easily. "Busy, as usual. You know how it is, but it's good to catch up. I feel like it's been ages since we've hung out." "Yeah, it has," Marcus replied, his tone neutral, his eyes shifting to Madison. "I guess life gets in the way." Madison laughed, a bit too brightly. "That's why family is so important, right? Keeping those connections strong." Marcus clenched his jaw slightly. There was something unsettling in the way she said it. He nodded, but inside, his suspicions were hardening into certainty. As the evening went on, he watched them, studying every subtle glance, every seemingly innocent smile, the way their hands seemed to hover near each other just a second longer than necessary. He felt himself slipping into a daze, wondering if he was going crazy or if he was simply seeing the truth for what it was. That night, after Tristan left, Marcus lay in bed, his mind racing. He knew he needed answers, something concrete. The next morning, he made the call he'd been avoiding. He hired a private investigator. He didn't want to believe that the people closest to him could be betraying him, but he also couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Days turned into an agonizing week, with Marcus barely able to focus at work, glancing at his phone every few minutes, hoping for an update. Finally, the investigator called. Mr. Reynolds. The investigator's voice was steady, but Marcus could sense the gravity of what was coming. We have some information. I'll send over the photos and records for you to review. You should be prepared. It's not easy to see. A pit formed in Marcus's stomach as he waited for the email. When it finally came, he took a deep breath and clicked on the attachments. Photo after photo filled the screen. There was Madison, smiling, laughing, leaning close to Tristan, their faces inches apart. A photo of them holding hands at a secluded cafe, another of them sharing what looked like an intimate dinner. And then, photos of them outside a hotel, disappearing through its doors together late at night. Each image drove a nail deeper into his heart, confirming what he'd feared. This wasn't a fleeting mistake or a one-time lapse in judgment. It was an affair, a prolonged, calculated betrayal by the two people he trusted most. As he scrolled through the files, his anger simmered, his face hardening with each new image. He clenched his fists, breathing heavily, fighting to control the rage that threatened to consume him. But he wouldn't confront them, not yet. He needed a plan. That evening, Madison returned home, smiling as she entered the kitchen where Marcus was seated. He pretended to be engrossed in the newspaper, though his mind was on the damning evidence he'd just reviewed. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked casually, walking over to pour herself a glass of water. "Busy," he replied, keeping his tone neutral, not looking up. He felt his pulse spike at the sound of her voice. Every word from her mouth now felt like a lie. She sat down across from him, her eyes flickering toward the newspaper. "Anything interesting?" Marcus looked up at her, holding her gaze for a moment longer than usual. "Nothing I didn't already expect," he said quietly, his tone carrying an edge that he hoped she didn't notice. She gave a nervous laugh, brushing her hair behind her ear. "You seem tense. Is everything okay?" He took a sip of water, suppressing the urge to confront her then and there. "I'm fine. Just a long day." She studied him for a moment, but seemed satisfied by his response. "Well, maybe we should have a relaxing weekend, just the two of us and our baby. It's been a while since we've done something together." Marcus raised an eyebrow. The nerve of her, he thought. "That sounds good. Maybe we can talk then." She seemed pleased with his response, her smile widening. "Perfect. I'll plan something nice for us." Marcus nodded, though his mind was elsewhere, already plotting the steps he'd take. He was determined to make them feel the same betrayal he was now enduring. The following day, Marcus called Tristan, trying to keep his voice steady as they spoke. "Hey, I was thinking we could get together soon. It's been a while since it was just us." "Sounds good, man," Tristan replied, his tone as cheerful as ever. "How about this weekend?" Marcus forced himself to stay calm. "Sure, I'll let you know. I'm planning something special." He hung up, his hand trembling as he set the phone down. The deceit, the lies, the betrayal, it was all unraveling in front of him. Yet he knew he needed to wait for just the right moment. He wanted the impact to be undeniable. That night, Marcus lay awake, his mind racing with plans. He imagined confronting them in public, exposing them in front of their friends, family, everyone they knew. He envisioned their smug faces crumbling, their lies unraveling under the weight of the truth. Finally, unable to sleep, he got out of bed and made his way to the den, pulling open the drawer where he'd stashed the photos and records. He looked through each image again, a renewed sense of anger building as he absorbed the betrayal. His fingers trembled as he clenched the papers, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge. He didn't know when the right moment would come, but he knew it was coming. Marcus's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sped to the hospital, adrenaline coursing through him. He'd waited for this day, hoped that perhaps the birth of his child would bring some clarity, something that could help him make sense of the betrayal. Yet, an uneasiness settled over him as he parked the car and walked through the hospital doors. He approached the maternity ward, a knot forming in his stomach. He was ready to greet his newborn son, to be there for him despite everything else that had happened. But as he reached the entrance, a nurse stepped in front of him, blocking his way. "Sir, you can't go in right now," she said politely, though her face showed concern. "Your brother is already inside with them." Marcus's heart stopped. He blinked, trying to process her words. "My brother?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "Yes," she nodded, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. "He's in there with your wife and the baby. He's been here for a while." Blood pounded in his ears as Marcus took a steadying breath, forcing himself not to react. He nodded at the nurse, his face a mask, and brushed past her, his heart pounding louder with every step toward the room. When he reached the door, he paused, gathering himself before slowly pushing it open. The sight before him hit him harder than he'd imagined. Tristan sat in a chair by the hospital bed, cradling the newborn. He held the baby with a gentleness and intimacy that stung, as if he were looking at his own child. Madison lay in the bed, her face soft with a smile as she gazed at Tristan. She hadn't noticed Marcus enter. Marcus felt his chest tighten, but he stayed silent, standing in the doorway, watching as his worst fears unfolded in front of him. Then he heard Madison's voice, her words low, almost a whisper, but in the silence of the room, they were clear enough. "Once he's older, we'll tell him the truth about his dad. Until then, we'll use Marcus's money and support to raise him." The words cut through him, each one like a knife. His fingers curled into fists, his anger rising, red-hot and raw. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over them, and they both looked up, startled. Madison's smile vanished, and Tristan's face turned a shade paler. "Oh, Marcus," Madison stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus held up a hand, silencing her. He kept his voice calm, though every fiber of his being shook with fury. "No need to keep up the act. Everyone's seeing this," he said icily, his eyes moving between them. "Check your phones. The video of you both is viral. Your lives just became public." He could see their confusion turn to shock as they reached for their phones. Tristan unlocked his first, his face contorting as he watched the video. Madison followed suit, her hands trembling as she looked at her own screen. The footage was clear, moments of them together, laughing, whispering, stolen touches, all captured for the world to see. How could you do this?" Madison's voice was barely audible, a mix of anger and horror. "Oh, it was easy, Madison," Marcus replied, his voice dripping with cold satisfaction. "You two left enough clues to make it easy for anyone to see the truth. But I made sure everyone knows now, not just me." Tristan looked up, his face pale, his usual arrogance replaced with a vulnerability Marcus had never seen. "Marcus, please, this doesn't have to go this far. We can work this out. Work it out." Marcus's voice turned sharp, his eyes flashing. "You thought I'd be okay raising a child that's not mine, supporting your little family behind my back?" Madison reached out, her face etched with panic. "Marcus, please listen to me. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't want it to happen this way." Marcus stepped back, his expression hardening as he looked down at her, his voice steely. "No, you didn't want to get caught. That's what this is about. You'd keep me in the dark forever if you could, using me like I was nothing but a wallet to you." Tristan lowered his head, trying to keep his voice steady. This is between Madison and me, Marcus. You shouldn't have made it public." "Oh, but it is public now. Everyone's going to know exactly who you are. Everyone knows what you've done." Marcus's face was set, his voice unwavering. "And as for the baby, I'm not paying a damn for your affair, kid." Madison's face crumpled, the realization sinking in. "Marcus, please. You can't walk away like this. I need your help. We need your support. Did you think about that before you betrayed me?" Marcus asked coldly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you think about the consequences, about what this would mean? Or did you just assume I'd keep playing along? Clueless?" Madison reached out again, desperation in her eyes. "Marcus, please. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for things to go this far." Marcus shook his head, his expression unchanging. "You and Tristan took everything I built, every ounce of trust one had, and threw it away. You want forgiveness? Beg for it somewhere else. Tristan finally spoke, his tone defensive. Look, Marcus, this happened, okay? It's not like we planned it. They just got out of hand. Things got out of hand because you had no respect for me, Tristan. Marcus snapped, his voice laced with disgust. I trusted you. I looked up to you. And you decided that wasn't worth anything. Tristan's gaze fell, shame coloring his face, but Marcus didn't care. The weight of their betrayal, the deception he'd endured, it was all out in the open now, and there was no going back. I'm done, Marcus said finally, his voice steady. I'll walk away. But know this, every time you look at that child, you'll remember that he's the product of lies and betrayal. Madison sobbed, clutching the blanket as she watched him turn toward the door. Marcus, please don't go. Don't leave us like this. He paused in the doorway, turning back to face them, his expression cold. You made your choice, Madison. Both of you did. Now you'll live with the consequences. With that, he walked out, his steps firm and unyielding as he left them to face the aftermath of their betrayal. The truth was out, and now the weight of it would rest on their shoulders alone. As he stepped into the hospital corridor, a strange calm settled over him. He'd lost everything he thought he'd had, but he'd reclaimed something far more valuable, his self-respect. For the first time in months, he felt free, and with that freedom came a resolve to start anew, to build a future on his own terms, untainted by lies and deceit. Outside, he took a deep breath, feeling the cool air hit his face as he stepped into the open. He'd faced the truth, endured the pain, and walked away from the wreckage with his head held high. The fallout hit faster than Marcus could have anticipated. The video, a shocking revelation of betrayal, spread through their social circles like wildfire. Colleagues, friends, and family members recoiled in disgust at the sight of Madison and Tristan, two people they had trusted and admired, caught in a betrayal that was now public knowledge. Marcus received texts and calls, some from people expressing disbelief, others sending messages of support. It was as though everyone in their lives had an opinion on what had happened. He watched as Madison and Tristan's reputations crumbled overnight. Soon, Tristan lost his job. His employer cited ethical misconduct and damage to company reputation as the reasons. Madison, meanwhile, was let go from her own position as clients and colleagues pulled back, unwilling to associate with her after the scandal. One night, barely a week after the hospital incident, there was a knock at Marcus's door. He knew, before even opening it, who would be standing there. He took a deep breath, steadied himself, and pulled the door open. There stood Madison, looking gaunt and worn, her hair unkempt, face blotchy from crying. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her hands shook as she clutched a thin blanket around her shoulders, though the night was warm. Marcus, she began, her voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. Please let me in. Marcus crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. He took in her appearance, noticing the subtle changes, the stress, the guilt, the weight of her decisions finally showing on her face. But his heart, hardened by her betrayal, felt nothing. What do you want, Madison? His voice was cold, almost devoid of emotion. She bit her lip, hesitating. Please, Marcus. I know I don't deserve to ask, but I'm desperate. Tristan, he's been staying with a friend, and I have nowhere else to go. The baby, he's innocent in all this. He's your son. At the mention of the baby, Marcus's gaze flickered. He thought about the child, thought about the life that had been thrust into chaos by the choices of the adults around him. But he forced his voice to remain firm. Is he really innocent, Madison? He asked, his tone laced with bitterness. I don't know what he is to me anymore. For all I know, you and Tristan planned this from the beginning, and now you're here because you need money. My money. Madison's face crumpled. It wasn't like that, Marcus. It had just happened. I never wanted to hurt you. We never meant for this to happen. You didn't mean for this to happen? Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. Do you even hear yourself, Madison? You didn't just hurt me. You betrayed me in every possible way and lied about it for months. I was ready to be a father, to build a life for us. You took all of that and destroyed it. So, don't stand here and tell me you didn't mean for it to happen. Tears streamed down her face as she sank to her knees, her hands reaching out, palms open, pleading. Marcus, please. I'm begging you. I know I don't deserve it, but please. We're struggling. I can't even afford formula for the baby. My accounts, they're all frozen, and Tristan, he doesn't have anything." Marcus's jaw clenched as he looked down at her, the woman he had once thought he would spend the rest of his life with, now reduced to begging for scraps. He knelt down, meeting her gaze levelly, his voice as hard as stone. "This is the life you chose, Madison. You wanted Tristan. You wanted something more, something different. You got it. And now you're here because you didn't think about the consequences." She shook her head desperately, reaching for his hand, but he pulled back, his face expressionless. "I loved you, Madison," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I would have given you the world, and you threw it all away." She sobbed, looking up at him, her face twisted with guilt and regret. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I am. I know nothing I say can make it right, but please, please don't let us suffer. Not the baby. He didn't ask for any of this." Marcus straightened, his gaze unyielding. "I'm not responsible for your choices, Madison. You two wanted to use me, to lie to me, to raise this child off my back. Now you're seeing what it's like without me. I won't support you. I won't support Tristan. I'm done." She lowered her head, sobbing into her hands. The sound was raw, broken, but Marcus forced himself to stay firm. This was the path she had chosen, and he would not be the safety net that saved her from it. Finally, Madison lifted her head, her voice small, barely a whisper. "What am I supposed to do?" Marcus shook his head. "That's up to you. You've made your decisions. Now, you'll have to face the consequences." He turned his back, his heart pounding with the weight of what he was leaving behind, but his steps steady. As he closed the door, he could still hear her faint, choked cries from the other side. He took a deep breath, letting the silence of the house settle over him, a strange calmness filling him as he walked away. The next day, Marcus heard from a mutual friend about Tristan. It seemed that, after being publicly humiliated and losing his job, Tristan had been shunned by nearly everyone they knew. His so-called friends had distanced themselves, and his family barely spoke to him. That night, Marcus received a message from Tristan himself. A brief, almost pleading text. "Marcus, please. Let's talk. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm begging you. Just hear me out." Marcus deleted the message without responding. Over the next few weeks, Marcus watched from a distance as Tristan and Madison struggled. He knew they were scraping by, barely able to pay their bills, their lives in shambles. Madison reached out a few more times, each message growing more desperate, but Marcus remained silent. He had given her everything, and she had repaid him with deceit. Now, she and Tristan would feel the full weight of their actions. One evening, while Marcus was out for a walk, he ran into an old friend, Olivia. They hadn't spoken in years, but they caught up, talking easily as they strolled down the street. She was warm, compassionate, and seemed genuinely interested in how he was doing. For the first time in months, Marcus felt something close to peace. As they parted ways, Olivia gave him a soft smile. "Take care of yourself, Marcus. You deserve better." Her words lingered with him long after she left, a reminder that life would go on. Months rolled by like chapters in a book, each day pulling Marcus further from the bitterness and betrayal that had once consumed him. He embraced solitude as his teacher, spending quiet mornings alone, reflecting on who he had been and who he wanted to become. In this newfound calm, he began to heal. His routine changed. He threw himself into work with a vigor that had been missing. Projects he'd once seen as tedious challenges became outlets, goals he poured himself into. His colleagues noticed the shift, and one afternoon his boss called him into the office. "Marcus, I've noticed your work lately," his boss said, studying him closely. "Your focus, your energy, it's impressive. Have you thought about taking on a new role here? Maybe even a promotion?" Marcus nodded, a slight smile breaking his otherwise calm expression. "I'll be open to that. I think I'm ready for something more." His boss gave him a knowing look. "Good. Let's make it happen." Outside of work, Marcus rekindled friendships he'd let drift. He'd stopped reaching out to friends in recent years, but now he found himself making an effort, going to dinners, game nights, and even an occasional weekend trip. One night, his friend Tom invited him to a local art exhibition. Tom knew Marcus had once dabbled in painting, a hobby he had abandoned somewhere along the way. "You should come with me, Marcus," Tom suggested, nudging him with an elbow. "Get back into it. You're good at this stuff." At first, Marcus hesitated. Art had been his passion once, but he'd stopped creating when life became too busy and complicated. But something in him sparked, and he agreed. Walking through the gallery, he felt a sense of inspiration he hadn't experienced in years. He left the exhibition that night and went home, finding himself sketching until the early hours of the morning. Around this time, he crossed paths with someone who would become an unexpected source of light, Rachel. She was a friend of one of his colleagues, a kind, genuine woman with a quiet strength that immediately drew him in. Their first meeting happened by chance. He was at a small cafe, grabbing coffee after a long day at work, when he heard someone call his name. "Marcus?" Rachel asked, smiling as she approached. He recognized her from a recent office event, where they had exchanged a few words in passing. "Rachel, right?" "Small world." She laughed, and they ended up sitting together, talking long after their coffee cups had emptied. Rachel listened intently as he spoke, never prying, but always making him feel at ease. He found himself sharing things he'd held back from most people, opening up in a way he hadn't expected. The friendship grew quickly. Rachel became his confidant, someone he could talk to about anything, his work, his rediscovered love for art, and eventually, even the painful past he was trying to leave behind. One night, after they had dinner at a cozy little restaurant, Rachel took his hand as they strolled through the city. "You know, Marcus," she said, her voice gentle, "you don't have to carry all that hurt with you forever. It's okay to let go." Marcus looked down at her hand in his, her warmth grounding him. "I know," he said quietly, "but I guess I'm afraid that if I do, I'll end up trusting the wrong person again." Rachel stopped, turning to face him. "Trust doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It just means you believe in yourself enough to handle whatever comes your way." Her eyes held his, sincere and steady. He thought about her words, feeling something inside him shift. "Thank you, Rachel," he murmured. "You have no idea what that means to me." As the months passed, their bond deepened. Rachel encouraged him in ways that felt natural, like the time she took him to a local art store and handed him a set of brushes. "Go on," she said, grinning. "Get back to it. Who knows what you'll create?" Marcus smiled, amused by her persistence. "Fine," he laughed, taking the brushes. "You win. But don't blame me if I make a mess." Back home, he stared at the canvas, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. He hadn't painted in years, but as he let the brush flow over the surface, color after color came alive. The process felt liberating, as though he was shedding old skin, layer by layer. One night, as they sat together on his couch, Rachel leaned in, resting her head on his shoulder. They were silent for a while, watching the lights of the city through the window. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked, breaking the silence. Marcus shifted slightly, thinking. "I do," he replied, his voice thoughtful. "For a while, I couldn't imagine one. But now," he looked at her, his expression softening. "Now, I think it could be good." Rachel smiled, squeezing his hand. "That's all I wanted to hear." As he spent more time with her, Marcus felt the bitterness fade. His scars, once raw and painful, had become reminders of what he had overcome. One evening, he even found himself laughing about something that had once hurt him deeply, sharing a memory from his past with Rachel. "That's the best revenge, you know," Rachel said with a smirk. "Moving on, finding happiness." Marcus chuckled, nodding. "You're right. It's not about getting even. It's about finding something worth living for again." With each passing day, he felt more at peace. His connection with Rachel grew into something meaningful, something real, and he felt himself slowly letting go of the past. One afternoon, as they walked by the riverside, Rachel paused, looking out over the water. "Marcus, I think I love you," she said softly, almost as if she hadn't meant to say it out loud. He froze for a moment, her words filling him with warmth. He had never expected to hear those words again, never thought he would be able to say them. But looking at her, he realized he felt the same way. "I think I love you too, Rachel," he replied, his voice steady, feeling the truth of his words sink in. They stood together, their hands intertwined, watching the river flow, letting go of the hurt that had once held them back. Marcus felt a lightness he hadn't felt in years, a peace that came from finally finding someone who understood him, someone he could trust. For the first time, he could see a future not defined by betrayal or bitterness, but by the simple, quiet happiness he had found with Rachel. The scandal had ravaged Madison and Tristan's lives in ways they hadn't imagined. They'd lost their jobs, their friends, and whatever fleeting thrill had fueled their affair. Now, every glance from a stranger felt like judgment, every encounter with a former friend an exercise in shame. Their reputations were in tatters, and they faced relentless scorn from people who once respected them. Madison and Tristan tried to build a life together, but the constant financial strain, coupled with the disdain of those around them, poisoned whatever hope they had left. Arguments replaced affection, resentment replaced desire. Days turned into a grueling routine of rejection, frustration, and blame. Each day, as they struggled to make ends meet, Tristan's once confident charm and Madison's spark faded. The house they had rented felt less like a home and more like a cage where regret gnawed at them daily. One evening, Tristan came home late, his face weary, the faint scent of alcohol on his breath. Madison, rocking their baby in her arms, looked up with an exhausted expression. She had spent the day trying to scrape together enough money for groceries, only to realize their accounts were barely surviving. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice strained. Tristan sighed, dropping onto the worn-out couch. "Looking for work. What does it matter?" "It matters because I'm here trying to hold everything together while you're out." Her voice cracked, frustration boiling over. "Don't start, Madison," he snapped, rubbing his temples. "I didn't ask for any of this. You think this is easy for me?" The baby stirred in her arms, letting out a small cry. Madison looked down, her heart aching. She had hoped this child would bring them closer, give them a purpose amid the chaos. But all she felt now was regret. She and Tristan had made choices that had turned their lives into this nightmare. As days passed, the tension only grew. Their arguments became louder, angrier. One evening, during a particularly heated argument, Madison's voice broke as she screamed, "We had a life, a real life with Marcus. Why do we throw it away?" Tristan's face darkened. "You think I don't know that? But it's too late now. He'll never take us back. You know that." A realization struck Madison with painful clarity. There was only one person who could help them now. Marcus. She knew she had no right to ask him for anything after what she and Tristan had done. But her desperation outweighed her shame. If not for herself, then for her child. The next morning, Madison gathered her courage. She wrapped her son in a blanket, holding him close as she walked the familiar path to Marcus's house. With every step, memories flooded back, the warmth of their shared life, the laughter they once shared. She couldn't help but wonder how differently things might have been if she hadn't given in to temptation. Standing on Marcus's doorstep, she hesitated, her heart pounding. She took a deep breath and knocked, her grip tightening around her son. The door opened slowly, and there he was, Marcus, standing tall, looking calm and composed. His face betrayed no emotion as he looked at her and then at the child in her arms. "Marcus," her voice faltered, caught between shame and desperation. I need your help." He folded his arms, his gaze unwavering. "Madison, what could you possibly want from me now?" She swallowed hard, glancing down at their son. "It's him, Marcus. He deserves a better life. He doesn't have to suffer because of our mistakes." Marcus's face remained impassive. "And what exactly do you expect me to do, Madison? After everything?" Her voice trembled as she pleaded. "I know I don't deserve anything from you. I know that. But please help us. Just for him. He's innocent in all this." Marcus studied her silently, his gaze piercing. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke, his voice cold but controlled. "Do you even hear yourself? The only reason you're here is because your life has fallen apart. I spent years giving you everything, building a life, planning a family. And you threw it all away for a fantasy with my own brother." Tears filled her eyes, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I know. I know I ruined everything. But he's your son too, Marcus. He deserves a chance. Does he? Marcus replied, his tone biting. You expect me to turn my life upside down again because of the choices you made? The lies? The betrayal? Madison's voice cracked as she whispered, Please, Marcus. We're struggling. I don't want him to grow up like this, feeling unwanted, unloved. Is that what you thought I'd feel? He interrupted. Unwanted? Unloved? I devoted myself to you, Madison. I wanted to be a father, to build a family with you. And you destroyed that. He took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Now, you want me to clean up your mess? Madison's last shred of pride shattered as she dropped her gaze. I don't know what else to do, Marcus. We're desperate. Marcus sighed, a mixture of pity and resolve flickering in his eyes. You want my help? He asked, voice low. Fine. I'll make sure he's taken care of. I won't let him suffer because of you. But I'll be clear about one thing, Madison. You won't be a part of my life. Not ever again. Her eyes widened, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Well, what do you mean? He took a deep breath, the anger softening but replaced with steely determination. I'll support him financially. Make sure he has what he needs. But as for you and Tristan, you're on your own. This is the life you chose, and now you'll live with it. Madison stared at him, her face a mix of despair and acceptance. I understand. She choked out, her voice barely audible. And one more thing, Marcus added, his tone sharp. Don't ever come to me again with your problems. I'm done being used by you. This is the last time. She nodded, too defeated to argue, too ashamed to protest. She gathered her son close, her heart heavy with the realization that the man she once loved would never forgive her. As she walked away from his house, the weight of her choices pressed down on her with each step. When she returned to the small, dingy apartment she now shared with Tristan, he looked up from the couch, his eyes dull. Did he help? He asked, his voice tinged with a faint hope. Madison shook her head slowly. He'll help, but not us. Only the baby. Tristan's face fell, and for a moment, he looked as defeated as she felt. We did this to ourselves, didn't we? He muttered bitterly, rubbing his face with his hands. Madison didn't answer. She felt hollow, a shell of who she used to be. They had traded stability, love, and family for a fleeting passion, a temporary escape. Now, all that remained was regret. That night, as she rocked her child to sleep, she thought of Marcus's words, the cold finality in his voice. She knew she would never be able to undo the hurt she had caused, never again have a place in his heart. And with a painful clarity, she realized she had no one to blame but herself. In the months that followed, Madison and Tristan's lives remained a series of struggles and compromises, each of them haunted by the memory of what they had lost. The joy they once shared had long faded, replaced by the reality of their choices. And as the years passed, the weight of their betrayal lingered like a shadow, reminding them of a past they could never escape. Marcus's journey wasn't an easy one. After the hospital confrontation, he grappled with a tidal wave of emotions, anger, sorrow, disbelief that had consumed him. He had severed ties with both Madison and Tristan, but the hurt lingered, an ache that seemed unrelenting. His vengeance had been precise and public, but Marcus knew that true healing would require more than justice. It would require him to rebuild himself from the ground up. For a long time, Marcus immersed himself in his work. Days turned into nights in his office, meetings and projects filling the void left by his shattered marriage. He took up new hobbies, cooking, running, even meditation. These pursuits grounded him, showing him glimpses of a life he could live for himself rather than for anyone else's approval or comfort. Through friends, he met Rachel. Their first encounter was casual, a chance meeting at a cafe, where they shared a conversation about travel and life goals. There was something in her smile, something genuine and open, that drew him in. Rachel was calm, warm, and without pretension. She listened without probing, laughed easily, and seemed comfortable with herself in a way that Marcus found refreshing. Their friendship grew, fueled by long conversations and quiet walks. Rachel never pressured him to speak about his past, but she sensed the scars he carried. One evening, Over a quiet dinner in her apartment, he finally opened up, telling her everything. "I can't believe I trusted them so blindly," he admitted, shaking his head. "I thought I knew what my life was, what I wanted my life to be. I thought I was building something real." Rachel placed her hand over his, her voice soft but steady. "I can't pretend to understand what you went through. But I see you now, Marcus. I see the strength you've built from that pain. You didn't let it break you." He looked at her, feeling a warmth he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I thought I'd never be able to trust anyone again. It's taken me so long to even think about moving on." Rachel smiled, her eyes kind. "You don't have to rush. Healing doesn't come with a deadline, Marcus. Just take it day by day." In Rachel's presence, Marcus began to shed the weight of his past. Slowly, he allowed himself to be vulnerable again, to experience the world without the shadow of betrayal coloring every encounter. They shared their hopes and fears, supported each other's dreams, and built a friendship that laid the foundation for something deeper. Months turned into years, and as their bond strengthened, Marcus felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known before. He and Rachel began to talk about the future, about what they wanted to create together. Rachel respected his journey and understood the scars he bore, and together, they found comfort in the shared vision of a future defined by honesty and resilience. One evening, after a quiet day spent hiking and exploring the countryside, Marcus turned to Rachel as they sat on a hillside overlooking the sunset. "I never thought I'd say this," he began, a hint of nervousness in his voice, "but you've made me believe in love again." Rachel reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "Love is about building something together, Marcus. It's about understanding and forgiveness, not just for others, but for ourselves." They married in a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by close friends. It was a quiet affair, far from the elaborate, showy events he had once thought necessary. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises rooted in understanding and the wisdom that only experience can bring. As they exchanged rings, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace, a closure he hadn't realized he needed. A few years later, they welcomed a child into their lives, a son who brought light and laughter into their home. Holding his son for the first time, Marcus felt a wave of emotion, a love so pure it washed away any lingering bitterness. He had been given a second chance, a chance to be the father he had once dreamed of becoming, to nurture a family built on trust and love. In his quiet moments, Marcus sometimes thought about Madison and Tristan. He knew they still struggled, burdened by the consequences of their choices. He had heard through mutual friends that their relationship had not survived, that life had been unforgiving. The pain of betrayal would always be a part of him, a reminder of the man he had once been and the lessons he had learned. But he no longer held on to anger or resentment. His past was just that, the past, a chapter he had closed. One evening, as Marcus sat beside Rachel on their porch, watching the sunset, his son asleep inside, he felt a peace that had eluded him for so long. Rachel turned to him, sensing his reflection. "Do you ever think about them?" He nodded, though his gaze remained on the horizon. "Sometimes, but not in the way I used to. It's strange, I thought I'd carry that bitterness forever. But now, I just hope they find their own peace." She placed her hand on his arm, a gentle reminder of the love they had built. "You're a good man, Marcus. You've come so far." He looked at her, gratitude filling his heart. "I never would have made it without you. You taught me to forgive myself, to let go." They sat in comfortable silence, the colors of the sunset casting a warm glow over them. Marcus knew he would always carry the scars of his past, but they no longer weighed him down. They were symbols of his strength, reminders of the journey he had taken and the resilience he had found. As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, Marcus wrapped his arm around Rachel, pulling her close. He no longer felt haunted by betrayal or anger. His life, his family was his true redemption. He had found love again, not just with Rachel, but with himself, with the future he had created from the ashes of his past.